Hi, dialoguers. Laura Hum here. I'm one of the Dialogue Doctor editors, and I'm excited to be here with you doing my first solo episode. A little nervous, don't have Jeff to play off of or a writer to overshadow me with their amazing artistic ability. So we'll try to keep my feelings in check as we talk about boosting the emotional intensity of a scene based off of how much dialogue you're giving your reader. I'm going to call this the Zoom effect. And you might have heard us talk about zooming in and zooming out on dialogue in other podcasts. We might have talked about it as the speed of the dialogue or the pacing of the dialogue. More recently, we've started using pacing to be the balance of dialogue between different voices. So how often one character talks in relation to other characters. So we kind of moved away from that language and really started using this language about zooming. And we like this idea of zooming because it plays a part in our life all of the time, right? Like organization and zooming helps us focus on the things that we need to focus on and kind of take the distractions out and really just focus on what it is that we want. And when we have our readers reading our stories, we want them focusing on our characters' emotional journeys. You've probably seen us or heard us if you've been in the community for any time talking about this idea that a story is an emotional journey, or we're taking the readers on a roller coaster and the intensity of that emotion should build toward the character's change and the character's arc and their growth. I'm not going to get into a lot of the details of that today. If you're interested in learning more about those things, about how you use emotion and story structure to engage your readers, or how different voices and different characters play a role in that, I suggest going back to some of the earlier episodes. Episode 38, Jeff does a great discussion about modulating character voice for emotional impact that really focuses kind of like on the scene level. How do you change a voice to get your reader really engaged? And then episode 42, he talks about deconstructing story structure. So about how you put those scenes together into a line so that the rise and the fall of the emotions creates a journey for the readers. And then in episode 60, he talks about vehicles, engines, anchors, and hazards, and how each different character voice can build a part, or excuse me, play a part in that emotional roller coaster. So definitely go back if you haven't listened to those, definitely go back and check those out. Jeff, as always, drops a ton of knowledge on us, which is great, especially those of us who are just learning how to write or are really starting in the editing process, kind of for the first time, focusing on those voices. Also great for experienced writers. We have a lot of experienced writers in the community, and they are always really excited to tell us all the new stuff they're learning. So if you're interested in those things, definitely go ahead and jump into those. But today, like I said, we're going to focus on zooming in on that dialogue to create the emotional intensity. So you keep hearing us say things like the reader connects to the story through the dialogue. And we want the reader to connect to emotions. And then we say things like zoom in on your dialogue, but we're not always telling you exactly what that means or how it looks different in a scene that's emotionally intense versus a scene that's really story focused. So today we're really going to talk about what we can do in the editing process. It works in the writing process too, but sometimes I think, especially if we're new to this, focusing on this in the editing process can actually be a little bit easier because we have the story we want to tell on the page and we can just move things around. So let's get into it and let's actually start with this idea of what this zoom effect is. Zooming builds emotional intensity. We know this in our everyday life. We know it when we're taking pictures of our vacation. If we are really excited about a new place that we're going, we tend to take far away pictures where the scenery is the focus. Yeah, the people are in the picture, but we're not really connecting with the people in those pictures. We're connecting with the scene. This is that introduction part of a scene where we're really helping the reader orient to what's happening. Who's in the scene? Where's the scene taking place? What are we talking about? maybe what happened in the break between the end of the last scene and this scene. We're really orienting the reader to that. And we're introducing this idea that, hey, we're going to go on this emotional journey. Then as we start to zoom in a little bit more, we're building those emotions a little bit more. If we're talking about taking pictures, we are zooming in on the background and you're seeing full people. You might not be able to see the expressions on their faces yet, or not as much as you could, but you're starting to like get excited about the story that they're telling. And then when we zoom in all the way, we can really see the emotions on someone's face, them smiling in their vacation picture, or whatever else it is that emotion that we're trying to convey in our pictures. Maybe it's engagement photo, and you can just see kind of the love and excitement that you can see on the couple's face as they're getting engaged. The background is there. We want it in the picture because we want to make sure that we know where it happened when we're remembering it, but we're really focusing on this emotion. So if we're looking at that in like 3 sections, we have this idea that we're introducing the emotions, then we're building those emotions, and then we're spending time really feeling those emotions. And if we kind of take that and we use a metaphor of a road trip, it actually kind of lines up really well. Now, why are we using a metaphor of a road trip? Well, we're using a metaphor from a road trip because I just got back from a road trip. My friend and I took her 2 oldest daughters on a girls' trip. We drove from Olney, Maryland, which is just north of Washington, D.C., down to Charleston, South Carolina. Now, road trips for me are something super exciting. I love a good road trip. I love packing all my snacks. I love looking at all my maps and figuring out where we're going to go and where we're going to stop and how long it's going to take us. And it always takes longer because I love to make stops. And so we have this trip planned, and we get in the car, and the trip starts with all this excitement, right? Like, oh, we're going on a trip. We're going on a trip. Well, it's about an 8-hour trip without traffic and without stops. So you figure after you stop and eat and get gas and use the bathroom and whatever else in traffic, it's probably going to be 10 hours. So we get in the car and we're really excited. And then we start driving. And then all of a sudden, that excitement starts to wane a little bit because we realize we have 10 hours ahead of us. So what are we going to do? We're going to talk, and we're going to pass the time. We're going to eat snacks. We're going to listen to the radio, have a couple of playlists made up, all of those things that are going to pass the time. And then as we get closer, we're going to start zooming in on those feelings. As we get closer to the city, it gets more exciting. And then as we get into the neighborhood where we're stopping, it's even more exciting, and we're looking for signs and those sorts of things. So it happens in our everyday life. If you are a fan of television, as many of us in this community talk about a lot, the camera people in video and movies do this for us all the time. They start a scene with an establishing shot where you're seeing kind of the sweeping landscape or the building that you're in. And then as we are in that introduction phase, we're seeing all the people in the room. And then as the conversation starts to build and the emotion starts to build, they're zooming in, and you start seeing one character over the shoulder of another character. You're seeing 2 characters talk to each other from a much closer screen. And then when that emotional intensity starts to get really big, you start to get those face framing shots. And if you're watching Fox or anything made by the Fox network, they get super, super tight. And it's like just from right above the eyebrows to like right below the mouth. It's so intensely close. It's I find it a little disconcerting, but I also found it's one of those things that before I noticed it, I never paid any attention to it. But now that I know that it happens, I find it really hard to like turn that part of my brain off and just enjoy the story. So for those of you who are hearing the Zoom effect from a TV for the very first time, I apologize. I should have said spoiler alert there, because once you see it, I find it really hard to unsee it. Hopefully it's a little bit easier for you. So let's talk about how that works with this idea of a road trip. So we've got this introduction. This is like we're on the interstate. The car is moving pretty fast. We are focusing on the stuff that's happening around us, like the music, right? We're listening to our favorite podcast, Dialogue Doctor, or any other podcast you listen to, maybe a book on tape. Maybe we're just listening to a playlist that we have. If we're using our GPS, the GPS talks to us very far in between, right? Like there's a lot of songs that play, or we get a lot of chapters in between instructions about where to go because we're just on the interstate. We're just going and we're going. And if we're making the drive from Maryland to South Carolina, it's just 95 straight down until you're into South Carolina. So there's not a lot to do to pass the time, but just kind of get moving. If I were telling you the story of my road trip with my friend and her two daughters, if I told you everything that happened on Interstate 95, every sign I saw, every truck I passed, you would be bored to tears. So we want to move this part of the story quickly. And we want to kind of think about how we can get through this slow part or this boring part of the car ride, how we can get through it really fast. So then we can move into this idea of we're getting into the city. If you're using a GPS, the GPS starts talking to you a little bit more frequently. You know, pay attention, in 5 miles, you're going to look at this exit. You probably don't get as much music between directions from your GPS navigator. By the way, I find it really hard to talk about the GPS navigator, just a little bit of a side because, you know, hey, I'm talking to myself in my office. So I want to talk about whatever I want. I hate a GPS. I am old school. Yes, I am old enough to remember maps. We used to have Rand McNally's, both the printouts and the books. And when we wanted to go somewhere, we'd look it up and we'd find it on the map and we'd like map our trajectory. We'd write down our directions. And that's kind of how I like to do my trips. My spouse, on the other hand, and the people I were traveling with, I was traveling with, are not like that at all. They turn on their GPS when they get in the car. It doesn't matter where they're going. If they're going just to a different place for the first time, or if they're going someplace they've been a lot of times before, most of the time they're just going to turn that GPS on. And I think it's because I don't like to be told what to do, but that voice is so annoying for me. So it's kind of funny for me to think about how that voice interrupts the driving, because for me, it's just, I'm looking for the sign that I need to look for. Or I'm looking at like the amount of time that's passed when I start looking for those signs, and I know that I'm supposed to pay attention in the city. But anyway, just a little bit about me and road tripping. So I am very excited to hear about how you all feel about the GPS and the GPS voices. But I find it to be very polarizing. I hate it. People around me love it. Anyway, back to building emotional intensity in this city level. We're starting to focus more on the dialogue. We're focusing less on like, hey, how do I get to my destination? That excitement's building, right? Like we saw the sign for South Carolina and we turned from 95 on to 26 South. And we're getting really excited because we know we're so close to our final destination, and we're getting there and we're paying much more attention. And that intensity is building. There's still other things that are happening, right? Like we're still not making a turn every, half a mile or anything. We still have a ways to go, but we can focus more on what's happening. And that's where we want really our dialogue to make the shift from being balanced with our prose into really a good focus. And then we get into the neighborhood. And that's where we really want to start feeling these feelings. If you are listening to that GPS voice that makes me crazy, there's not a lot of time between when they say, hey, you're about to make a turn. You're about to make a turn now. Hey, you're about to make another turn. hey, pay attention, you're about to make another turn now, right? Like those directions start coming hard and fast. Those of us who aren't necessarily listening to the GPS, we're looking at the signs. And where on the interstate or in the city, we were just looking for the big names of the big places that we needed to go. But now when we're in the neighborhood, we're reading every single sign. We're looking at every single house number. We're really watching to make sure that nobody's running into the road. Yeah, on the interstate and some of the bigger roads, you have to pay attention to make sure nobody's running out in front of you. But the likelihood of a kid running out in front of your car on the interstate is probably pretty low. But when you're in a neighborhood, a kid can run out in front of you at any time. So you really want to stay focused on every action that you're taking, everything that you're doing. Okay, now we talked about this idea of introducing emotions, building emotions, and feeling emotions lots of times. But what does that mean for our actual story? What do we want to do in our story to make this happen? Okay, so the first thing is we want to divide our scene amongst intro, building, and feeling. Sometimes as writers, we have all of these details in our head and we really want to get them out. So we start with pages and pages of prose, and then we start getting into our action, and then we start getting into our dialogue. Readers will trust you in that, but it's going to be a much more intense emotional journey for them. If you can keep that introduction or that interstate driving to about 20 to 30% of your scene, and then your city to about 20 or 30% of your scene, and then you leave the bulk 40 to 60% of your scene for that really emotional, feely stuff, your reader doesn't have a chance to look away from your story. Now, the one thing that we have to remember about introduce and build is we talk about introduce and build as if we're going up the roller coaster and the feeling is at the top of the roller coaster. But we also have to remember that after that intense feeling happens, we got to bring our reader back to something because we want them to continue turning the page. So we don't want them from an emotional standpoint to get all the way back down to baseline. But we do have to think about, we don't necessarily want to end the scene in the middle of a quick back and forth, right? We might want to end the scene after there's a little bit of building or a little bit of introduction. So while we're talking about them as introduction language, they can also go at the tail end of the scene. But if you're going to put some of that interstate or city at the end of your scene, you want to make sure it comes out of the 20 or 30% that you have set aside for those sections. And again, that all that does is it just gets your reader to the heart of the emotion of your scene faster, so they don't have time for distractions like happens on the interstate, right? Like we start listening to a good song and they get distracted by the song and they forget to pay attention to the road for a little while, which is okay when you're on the interstate because most of the time you're on the interstate for a long time. So if you miss one exit or two exit signs, not a big deal because you probably have 50 more to go before you have to make an exit. All right, so that's the proportion of the scene that you want to spend in introduce, build, and feel. Now let's talk about your dialogue to prose ratio. This DPR, I love acronyms. I actually don't. I find them very confusing. But this dialogue prose ratio. If you are in the introduction, feel free to balance your dialogue and your prose at like a 1-to-1 ratio. As a reader, I really enjoy it when I get a line of dialogue and a line of prose and a line of dialogue and a line of prose. And I like it because I feel like I'm not eating my vegetables, right? When you can hide that prose in your dialogue, you can sneak vegetables into my diet and I won't even notice because I'm so excited about the dialogue that you can slip in a line of prose and I'm learning about your characters. I'm learning about your scene. I'm learning about your background. I'm learning what's happened before, but you're tricking me because you're hiding it in the dialogue. In the city part of the scene where you're actually building, you want to pull that prose back a little bit. And you want to think about your dialogue to prose ratio to be more of a 3-to-1. So 3 dialogue exchanges or 3 lines of dialogue. Remember, body language counts as dialogue. and one line of prose. Again, this idea that you're moving them away from, hey, we're learning about the scene and we're focusing more on what's about to happen. Something big is coming, so I want to start focusing on that, but I don't want to lose any of the context that I might need from that prose. So 3-1. Once you get into the neighborhood and you're really focusing on the feelings, you want to pull as much of that prose out as you can. And you really want to focus on dialogue, making sure that each character is moving fast back and forth between each other, because we want no distractions. We only want to be focusing on where we're going and the emotions that we're feeling. Any prose that you put in there is going to give us a chance to break from that emotion. It might distract us a little bit, and we don't want to be distracted. We want to stay feeling those feelings. So now we talked about the balance of the scene and how we're going to balance dialogue and prose. Let's talk about the kinds of things that we want to put in our prose. You may have heard us talk about this as texture to a scene. Now, texture in the Dialogue Doctor world is what gives the scene a full picture. So when we talk about writing a dialogue-centric scene, we talk about writing a dialogue-only first draft. And if you've never written a dialogue-only first draft, it's really starting with almost a screenplay where the only thing you're putting in are like where the scene is happening and then the back and forth. Jeff even recommends that instead of writing every character's name, you just use their initials, or a brief set of, if you have two characters that start with the same name, just a brief thing that just identifies who they are. So you can focus on just getting the words out. And then in your second pass, you go back in and you add this texture. And there are kind of 3 ways you can think about texture. Texture can be adding body language and additional dialogue components to convey emotion. That one we include in texture because often when we are new to writing dialogue, we forget that body language is part of dialogue. So we think about adding it as texture just to boost that emotion. If you're already used to adding body language, then I would not consider body language as texture, and I would consider it as dialogue. But again, the idea, it doesn't matter if you call it texture or if you call it voice or whatever you call it. The idea is that we just want you using it. Doesn't matter how you're classifying it. So after we're adding that body language, we want to add actions. And actions are anything that explains the movement. So if characters are walking down the street as they're having a conversation, because they're going from place 1 to place 2, you want to give us some landmarks as they're walking in that texture, so that we know when they get there, we're not surprised that they're doing this. We talk all the time about the West Wing and about how in order to keep the scenes moving, they use a lot of walk and talks. And this is the same idea here, right? Like if you're physically moving the characters as they're walking and talking, if you're showing it on camera, you can see that they've gone past different offices and, oh, now they're in the West Wing, right? Or they're in the Oval Office. I guess they're always in the West Wing, but they're just in the Oval Office now, right? But if you don't have the visuals of that, you have to explain that movement. So we are going to add action in that texture. And the last thing that we want to think about as texture is context. These are details, background stories, anything that is going to cause the reader to really not understand what's going on. World building comes in here a lot. Sometimes if we're writing a mystery and we come across a clue, sometimes we need the characters to kind of give us an idea of why this is a clue. And it's not just a gum wrapper that they found on the ground. This gum wrapper is important because at the last 3 crime scenes, they found gum wrappers, and maybe we didn't remember it or we didn't realize it, or maybe this is the first time they're making that connection. So those context examples. Sometimes we can count internal dialogue as texture. Sometimes we want to count internal dialogue as dialogue. It just depends on kind of how you want to write. But that's one of the reasons that we just talk about texture being body language, action, and context. But like body language, internal dialogue can kind of go either way. So now that we have an idea of what texture is, let's talk about how texture works in these three different types of zooms. In introduce, we want full texture. Again, if we're going to do a 1-to-1 dialogue to prose ratio, we have to have something to put in that dialogue, in that prose. So texture, that's where we want to put that. When we get into the build of the city, we want mid texture. We don't want as much as we had in the interstate, but we definitely want more than we've got in the neighborhood. This is a good place to explain movements, especially if you know you're about to go into the neighborhood and you're not going to have a lot of place to explain that. The context that you need, anything that you're going to need, anything that's triggering the next emotional response, you want to make sure that gets put in there. You probably want to hold your details in your scene building, and you want to limit those into the introduce or the interstate phase as much as you can. You can put them in the city build, but if you can kind of think about it as background in the first, context needed for the emotion in build. And then when you get into feel, you want almost no texture at all, because again, you just want that rapid back and forth between the characters, because we don't want your reader to give any excuse to be distracted from what's happening on your page. You want them feeling what your characters are feeling, and you don't want them to have any distractions at all. So now we have this idea of how we can build a scene based off of these three sections. I want to take a step back for a second, and I want to use a sports analogy to explain why this works. And I think sports might be a better way of helping us with this idea of we're going to help the reader stay focused and what we want them to have time to think about if we use a sports analogy. Plus, you're probably really tired of hearing me talk about the interstate. So let's talk about this introduce phase as we would think about American football. So when we are watching American football, each team sets up as either the offense or the defense. So we know at the beginning of a series of plays what that team is trying to do. If they're on offense, they're trying to move the ball down the field. If they're on defense, they're trying to prevent the ball from being moved down the field. We know what the setting is. But play happens in spurts. When the whistle blows and the ball snaps, it's really intense. And then the ball touches the ground and the whistle blows, and then there's a lot of people walking around and there's a huddle happening. And the teams have time to plan what they're going to do. That means for us as a viewer, if we look away, if we go into the kitchen and get a snack, if we run to the restroom to take a quick break, we're not really going to miss a lot of the action. We can probably take the dog for a walk and make it back before anything big happens if we time it right. This is that same idea when we're introducing the emotion. And I'm not saying that American football is not an intense and exciting game. It is for a lot of people. But if we're thinking about the dialogue and each team being a player and how often they're handling the ball and how quickly the back and forth happens, it's actually kind of a slow build into the game, which brings us into the build section. In the build section, we can think about football. And when I'm saying football now, I'm talking about the traditional sense of football that Americans call soccer. In this sport, both teams are constantly vying to be on offense or defense. But once your team has the ball, you're on offense, and your job is to be a defender and get that ball back into your section, right? So they're running when they're running practiced plays and they're focusing really hard on the intensity. And if you look away from the game, you might miss some, but you're not going to miss as much as you would if you were watching a field sport like tennis, but you're going to miss more than you would if you were watching American football. Again, all about timing. You can miss anything at any time, depending on when you walk away. But especially early in the game, you can walk away, grab a snack, whatever, walk the dog, and you can come back and the score is probably going to be still relatively low because the size of the field and everybody moving the ball around and trying to run their plays. But when we're talking about a really intense feeling game, we're talking about tennis. And this is when every play that a player makes combines offense and defense. I can't hit the ball in tennis, period. If I could play tennis, I couldn't hit the ball in tennis without making an offensive and a defensive move, right? I need to hit it because I need to get it back over the net because I have to defend my side of the court. But I also am trying to put it in a position on my opponent's court where they're not going to be able to reach it. So it's a combination of offense and defense, which means that the players need to have immediate reactions, right? They build their skills and they're bringing their skills to the table, but it's the immediacy of the game. If I look away, I'm going to miss a lot, right? Because every moment is an opportunity to score a point or to lose a point. So if we're thinking about this like dialogue, in that feels, in that intense place, we want the dialogue to be back and forth and back and forth and back and forth with very little else going on. Because if we look away from the screen, even for a minute, we could miss a shot that goes out of bounds, and that would be really disappointing. So that's in our book when we're reading and we're just line from character A, character B, character A, character B, character A, character B. We can even start dropping things like if we just have two characters in the scene, we can start dropping the dialogue tags and really just using those for emphasis instead of using them to help orient the reader. Now, if you have 3 or more people in the scene, yeah, you're going to have to use those dialogue tags. But again, the idea is you want the dialogue moving as fast as the ball moves in tennis because you don't want your reader to look away in that part of the scene. When you're getting into that, when you're going backward into that build part of the scene, you want to think about it like football, where you've got this idea that you can look away if you need to, right? Like the kids are asking for dinner, you can say, yeah, after this chapter, but you don't really have to give them your full attention, or your spouse. I mean, I don't know who asks for dinner in your house, but right, like you can watch the game, you can look away a little bit, but you really want to stay focused because you don't want to miss it. Versus in that introduction place where you've got the football happening, where you have enough time to talk about the background and the history of the players, and maybe you're looking up a statistic, or you're playing your fantasy football team and you're watching your fantasy football team stats, and if the kids ask for a snack, you say, yeah, okay, let's get you a snack so I can get back and watch the game when we get closer to the 4th down, right? So this idea of the amount of distractions that can happen between the dialogue, keeping the reader focused, is really kind of helpful in thinking about what we want in different sections of the story. All right. So now that we talked about why it works, because we're taking out distractions and keeping focused on dialogue depending on what part of the scene we're in. We talked about it from the standpoint of what it looks like if we're playing sports. We talked about what it looks like if we are taking a road trip. Let's talk about how we actually make this happen. And let's go back to this road trip idea, because again, I just took a road trip and I do love a good road trip. And let's talk about some road trip survival tips that actually help us from a practical standpoint when we're editing. So first of all, anytime we're talking about editing, I'm always going to recommend that you read, highlight, and plan before you actually start making any changes. So for those of you who haven't heard an editing prompt or done an editing class with us, read your piece. I don't care if you just finished writing it and you know exactly what's there. Read your piece. And whenever possible, you want to read your piece out loud If you can, grab a partner to read that scene out loud for you, because it definitely sounds different when you hear it than when you read it. It's something about the brain. People smarter than me have told me that this is an actual true thing. So I am just going to believe them and recommend to you all that you read aloud or have somebody read it to you. And then you're going to start highlighting. As you're highlighting, the goal of the highlights is to help you figure out where your transitions are or what things that you want to focus on. Sometimes when I'm doing editing trainings, I say use the colors or the highlights to focus on different voices so you can figure out the balance of the voices, and that works really great. Sometimes we talk about color coding based off emotions that you're trying to convey. That can work really great. Of course, it can get a little bit messy if you're trying to do both at the same time. So my recommendation for you is just figure out what works best for you for the type of editing that you're doing. If you're focusing on boosting the emotional intensity of the scene by zooming in to different levels, my recommendation is that you draw some lines in your scene to start making the distinction about when you're moving from that introduction to the place where you're moving into build, and when you're moving into build into that feel. Right? These don't have to be hard, fast lines, right? Like you're not crossing over a state line on your road trip. You're just driving down the highway and you're starting to notice, hey, I'm getting close to my exit. Maybe I need to start paying attention to my signs, right? That's kind of the idea that you want to do, or the idea that you want to have when you're doing this highlighting. And then this last section about making notes or planning, this is where you want to start making notes about what things do you want to change. Do you have too much prose in your feelings section? Do you have not enough prose in your intro section because your reader doesn't have any idea of what's happening? You started them right in the middle of an intense scene and it's happening in a black box for them. So just kind of making these identifications about what you want to change. Now, the reason that I always suggest that you identify the changes you want to make before you actually start making changes is sometimes things can happen at the end of your scene that are really important. And if you start making changes at the beginning of your scene, you kind of box yourself into a corner and then you can't change the stuff at the bottom. So that's why I definitely always recommend kind of thinking all the way through your changes before you actually start making them. So let's say now that you've read, highlighted, and planned or taken notes about what you're going to do. What are some of these road trip survival tips that are going to help us? So the first and foremost is use your distractions to pass the time. So you're on the interstate and you're listening to your music and you're getting a little bored. So you have a snack. Maybe you have your large Dunkin' Donuts sweet tea, which is my personal road trip favorite. It's also my personal everyday favorite, but I try to limit them sometimes. So you are using distractions in your car, hopefully safe distractions, to keep you focused and pass the time. We're going to do the same thing in that introduce section by using our prose to strategically move the story along. Now, sometimes as new writers, we want every moment of every character's day conveyed to our readers. Our readers don't necessarily need to hear every conversation or every word of every conversation that we have with our barista, right? We can simply say we picked up our sweet tea at the Dunkin' through the drive-through and we can move on. We don't have to show them that exchange because we can move the story forward faster. Because remember, we only want 20 to 30% of that part of the, or we only want 20 to 30% of our scene to be that intro section, which is balancing prose and dialogue. So we want to think about how we can get to the intense part of the scene faster. So we're going to use that strategically. Now, we do want some of that prose in the build section, so we can leave it there. But like we talked about a little bit ago, we want that prose in the build section to really give context to the moment, not necessarily context to where the scene fits in the larger story, like we would in the introduce, which if we were to put introduce at the end of the scene, we would also put it like how this affects what happens next. So now your question might be, well, if we're using these distractions to pass the time, what do we do when we have some of this context stuff that happens in the feel part or the neighborhood part of the conversation? Laura, you just said, if I'm playing tennis, I can't look away, but I have this really important thing that we need to introduce to the reader. My recommendation is if you have something important that needs to be revealed in the moment of that emotional intensity, put it in the character's mouth, right? If something happens that is so important that it is going to distract the reader and we need to know about it, the characters are probably going to talk about it anyway, right? Like if we're on our road trip and we're in the neighborhood and we're getting ready to turn into the parking lot and we see a cop car with its lights on run into that parking lot, we're not just going to ignore it and turn in. We're going to stop and we're going to be like, did you see that? What do you think's happening? Is you think it's safe? Should we go? Right? It's going to be part of the dialogue. So put it in their mouths. If it's background information and you want the characters to process it internally, that's okay. You can do it as internal dialogue, but that's still putting it in their mouth. The other thing that you can do is you can leave it as a lingering question for the readers. You got to be careful with that because you don't want to burden them to the why aren't they talking about this, but you can do it as you're coming out of that emotionally intense feel part of the scene as you're getting into the build, which I guess would be like deconstruct if it's at the end, but whatever. You can talk about it after, or you can preempt it by giving them a little bit of foreshadowing in the prose in the intro or the build section. But really, again, the idea is the introduced section should have your prose that focuses on how the story fits or the scene fits in with the bigger story. Your build should be about what's happening in this scene. And then whenever possible, you want the emotional intensity of the feel part of the scene to just be dialogue. If you're finding the need for prose, find a way to put it in their mouth. So those are your distractions. The next road trip essential is do not leave anyone behind, right? I feel like this is a no-brainer, but I also know that like when there are a lot of people road tripping, especially when there's a caravan, it can be really easy to leave someone behind. I mean, they made a whole series of movies, Home Alone, about a kid who gets left at home. It wasn't a road trip, but yeah, you guys got it. Bear with me. You all got it. Sorry. All right. So don't leave anyone behind. What does that mean from a writing standpoint? It just means make sure that you're balancing your voices and that no one gets hidden in your scene. Everyone should get equal time, especially when you're in the feel part of the scene. Now, you're probably thinking, but I have a character who hardly ever talks. Just because somebody doesn't talk doesn't mean they're not feeling something, doesn't mean they're not thinking about what's happening, doesn't mean they shouldn't be a part of the scene, because nobody wants to read a story about two people who are arguing, and then we think that the other person might have left because they're not involved in the argument, and then all of a sudden the third person just jumps in and we're like, whoa, where'd you come from? Right? Like we want to just make sure that everyone has equal time in the scene. You can do this, especially when we're doing that quick volley in tennis, by back and forth and back and forth, and somebody says, the third person says something. It doesn't have to be 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. It can be 1, 2, 3, 2, 1, 2, 1, 3, right? Like just make sure everybody stays there. If you've got a just 2-character scene and it's back and forth and back and forth, be careful when you're getting to lines that are more than a sentence or two long, because once you're in a tennis match and somebody's holding on to the ball longer than they should, they're not just volleying it back across the net, something's happening. Now we're focused over here and it's breaking that volley. And now we're like, oh, wait, now something's changed. Now one of these other distractions can come in. So try to keep those really balanced when you're in the feel section. You also want to make sure that your voices are all heard in the earlier parts of the scene, but because you're already balancing dialogue with prose as a 1-to-1 or a 3-to-1, the spacing of when everybody is seen in the scene, that's a weird thing to say, when someone makes an appearance in the scene can be a little bit more spread out. So don't leave anyone behind. The next thing is know your route. Know where your scene is going. Now, sometimes when you're writing a scene for the first time, you don't really know where you want your scene to go. It's totally fine, right? Like just write what happens. Let your characters surprise you. That's fantastic. But I'm talking about when you're editing. Know where you're going. Pull out your Rand McNally, or if you're using Google Maps or Apple Maps or whatever map program you love, MapQuest, if you're still into that, right? Like look up where you're going so you know when to make your turns. So if something happens and your GPS goes out and your helpful little voice doesn't tell you to make the turn, you're still paying attention. Okay, great. That's great road trip advice, Laura. But what does that mean for me when I'm writing and I'm editing? It means that you're going to modulate your voices as you move through your sections, right? So we've talked about this in the past that we want to modulate. It was actually one of the episode number 38, Jeff talks about modulation of voices to show emotional intensity, right? Like we don't sound the same when we're angry as we do when we're confused. We don't, and sometimes confusion leads into anger, right? Like we're not really sure what's happening. And as our conversation partner tells us more things, it makes us more and more angry, right? So we want to think about how those voices modulate. So just be aware that as you're dividing your scene, as you're moving that prose out and you're moving the scene into that feels, you also want your character's modulation to shift. Again, doesn't need to be a hard line. Here they're confused, here they're frustrated, here they're angry. No, it can be a smooth transition, but you just want to think that if your zoom level, I'll get the words right, if the zoom level of your emotion is zooming in, you also want that modulation to happen. Okay, the next thing that we want to do is we need to take a detour, right? Sometimes we are heading in one direction and we need to go a different way. Traffic gets in our way. We see a sign for a restaurant that we're really excited about. Maybe we want to stop there. The reason that this is important when we're writing is because we don't always need to focus on zooming in. Sometimes we get to a part in our scene when we need to back out and we need to zoom out. We need to add some more prose. Maybe we've added a character. Maybe we're removing a character. Maybe we finally got to a new location in our walk and talk. Maybe something happens that's presenting us new information. The telephone rings and we have to answer it. We're introducing another character. We're introducing new information. We have to back up a little bit, get back into our build, maybe even go as far back into our introduce, and then ramp back up into our zoom. I will say, if you zoom out, your zoom back in can happen faster than it did the initial time. So if you're all the way zoomed in into feel, and you have to back all the way back out to introduce, you can kind of jump pretty quickly through build back into feel. And you can do that much more quickly because your readers are already feeling the intensity of the scene. You just pulled them back for a second and then put them back in. Be careful though, if you take too many detours, your trip will take forever. Right? I mentioned earlier, my 8-hour trip took 10 hours. Actually, it took 12 hours on the way home because of all these detours, the traffic and all of those other things. That happens when your readers read your story as well. You take too many detours in the story and the reader can feel frustrated or fatigued and feel like, okay, now might be a good time to go get that snack I've been thinking about, because you have too many of the zoom in and zoom outs. So use them, but use them strategically. The next road trip survival tip that also works for editing is stretch your legs. Take a break. We often think editing has to be done all in one pass. Sometimes we need to take a break. Sometimes we think that we've got the emotional intensity of the scene right, but something's not working. We looked at it, we moved all the prose out of this section, but something isn't right about the pacing. Feels like both characters are being heard, but both of them sound like they sound exactly the same, right? You've got some muddy voices there and you're not really sure how to fix them. If you stop, take a break, stretch your legs, walk around, read a different scene, go back to your notes, do something to break you away from that, you come back to the driver's seat more refreshed and more rejuvenated and ready to take on the rest of the drive, or in this case, the rest of the scene. So don't be afraid to do that. It can be really helpful. And then, of course, the last thing that is important for every road trip and every writing exercise is just have fun. The tips that we've given you here today, they're not hard and fast rules. They're guides to help you think about dialogue in a different way than you've thought about it in the past. To think about how you can balance dialogue and prose in a different way. To think about how you can divide your scene up. Where can you put texture? If you're one of those writers who loves prose, and you're not used to pulling it out for large sections of your dialogue, this might be a great place for you to practice this. But maybe the division and proportions of your scene are not 20, 20, 40 for feel. Maybe you're more like 35, 35, and 30. So you've only got 30% in the feel section. And maybe that feels right for you. And that's totally okay. Because again, the idea here is just for us to give you some tools that allow you to think differently about what you're doing, right? Some of you are probably thinking about this dialogue to prose ratio where I'm like 1-to-1, 3-to-1, and 10-to-1, and you are just laughing at me going, that is never going to work. My dialogue to prose ratio is 1-to-10. I'm going to have 10 paragraphs of prose for every line of dialogue. If that works for you in your writing style, do that. We just want you to have a way of thinking about balance and focusing on the emotional intensity based off of the distractions that the reader has, in a different way, right? So if you're letting that tennis ball go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, we don't want to look away because we're afraid of what's going to happen. But if we're throwing the American football, the pigskin down the gridiron, right? Like gridiron? Yeah, that's what it's called. There's opportunities to have a snack. I talk about snacks a lot. I do like food. Anyway, you get the idea. Have fun with it. I'm really excited to hear what you all do with this. So leave us some comments if you are in the Slack community. I can't wait to hear your thoughts. This week's editing prompt is going to talk about this boosting emotional intensity using this technique. So I'm really excited for that. So if you are not part of the Slack community and you'd like to be, head on over to Jeff's Patreon page and get signed up for that. So now's a pretty exciting time to do that, start of the new year and all. So thanks everyone who made it this far for listening to me talk to myself and about road trips. So have a great day. I am going to stop the recording now, Jeff.